Margaret Henderson was the kind of person who measured her grass with a ruler every Saturday morning. At 52 years old, she had turned being the president of Willowbrook Gardens Homeowners Association into what felt like a full-time military operation. Her house sat perfectly centered on the corner lot, with white shutters that gleamed like fresh paint and flower beds arranged in mathematical precision. For 8 long years, Margaret had ruled over the neighborhood with an iron fist, wrapped in a velvet glove of fake politeness. She knew every single rule in the HOA handbook by heart, and somehow always managed to find new interpretations that made life difficult for everyone else. Her daily routine included 2 neighborhood patrol walks, one in the morning with her coffee and another in the evening with her clipboard. The other residents had learned to live with Margaret's particular brand of neighborhood tyranny. They would quickly move their trash cans exactly 6 feet from the curb after collection day, make sure their car doors closed softly after 9 p.m., and never ever let their children's toys stay visible in the front yard overnight. Most people just accepted that this was the price of living in Willowbrook Gardens. But everything changed on a sunny Tuesday morning in March when the moving truck pulled up to 42 Maple Street. The Rodriguez family was beyond excited about their new home. Miguel and Elena had saved for years to buy their first house, and the modest 2-story colonial with the big backyard felt like winning the lottery. Their kids, 6-year-old Sophia and 8-year-old Diego, were practically bouncing off the walls with excitement about having their own rooms and a real yard to play in. Miguel worked as a nurse at the local hospital, pulling long shifts to support his family. Elena taught 2nd grade at the elementary school just 2 miles away. They were the kind of neighbors anyone would be lucky to have, quiet, respectful, and always willing to lend a helping hand. Margaret noticed the moving truck before it even finished backing into the driveway. She positioned herself at her front window with a pair of binoculars, taking mental notes about every piece of furniture and every family member. The first red flag in her mind was the children's bicycle that got left on the front porch overnight. The second was the colorful welcome mat that Elena had placed by the front door. By the end of the first week, Margaret had already compiled a list of potential violations. The mailbox had a small dent on one side. The kids had drawn hopscotch, squares on the sidewalk with washable chalk. There was a small vegetable garden taking shape in the backyard that hadn't been pre-approved by the architectural committee. The first official violation notice arrived in the Rodriguez family's mailbox. On a Thursday afternoon, Elena found it when she got home from work. A crisp white envelope with the HOA logo stamped in the corner. Inside was a formal letter, typed in serious legal language, listing 3 violations and demanding immediate correction within 7 days. Elena read the letter twice, trying to understand what they had done wrong. The violations seemed petty and mean-spirited. How could children drawing with chalk on their own sidewalk be against the rules? Why did a tiny dent in their mailbox matter when it still worked perfectly fine? Miguel was exhausted after a 12-hour shift at the hospital, but he carefully read through the HOA handbook that night. The rules were written in confusing legal language, but he couldn't find anything that specifically prohibited children's chalk art or required mailboxes to be in perfect condition. The next weekend, Elena decided to introduce herself to Margaret properly. She had always believed that most conflicts could be resolved with honest conversation and maybe some homemade cookies. She spent Saturday morning baking chocolate chip cookies, the kind that made the whole house smell like happiness. Margaret answered her door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She accepted the cookies with stiff politeness, but made it clear that the violation still needed to be addressed immediately. When Elena tried to explain that the chalk was washable and would disappear with the next rain, Margaret's smile grew even more artificial. "Rules are rules," Margaret said, her voice taking on a tone that Elena would soon know very well. "If we start making exceptions for some people, then everyone will think they can do whatever they want. I'm sure you understand." Elena left that conversation feeling confused and slightly hurt. She had hoped for a friendly neighbor, maybe someone who could recommend a good pediatrician or share tips about the local schools. Instead, she found someone who seemed to view their family as a problem that needed to be managed. The following week brought 2 more violation notices. One was for Diego's soccer ball, which had been left in the front yard after school. The other was for what Margaret called excessive noise during inappropriate hours, which turned out to be Sophia practicing piano at 4:30 in the afternoon. Other neighbors started to notice the pattern. The Johnsons had lived next door to the Rodriguez family for 3 years, and they remembered their own early encounters with Margaret. Mrs. Johnson made a point of introducing herself to Elena at the grocery store, offering quiet words of support and warning. "Don't take it personally," Mrs. Johnson whispered in the cereal aisle. "She did the same thing to us when we first moved in, and the Patels before us, and the family before them. She just doesn't like change, and she especially doesn't like anyone who might challenge her authority." Elena began to understand that their situation wasn't unique, but that didn't make it any less frustrating. She and Miguel had worked so hard to buy this house, and now they felt like they were under constant surveillance. The kids started asking why the mean lady across the street was always staring at their house. Margaret's behavior grew more brazen as the weeks passed. She would walk slowly past their house during her evening patrols, sometimes stopping to take pictures of minor infractions. With her phone, she installed a new security camera that seemed to point directly at their front yard, though she claimed it was for her own property protection. The monthly HOA meeting in April was Elena's first experience with Margaret's public persona. The community center was half full with residents who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Margaret ran the meeting like a corporate boardroom, complete with PowerPoint presentations about grass height requirements and approved paint colors. When Elena raised her hand during the public comment period, the room grew noticeably quiet. She had prepared her words carefully, wanting to sound reasonable and cooperative. She explained that her family was new to the neighborhood and still learning all the rules. She asked for clarification about some of the violations they had received, and wondered if there might be a grace period for new residents to adjust. Margaret's response was swift and sharp. She stood up from her seat at the front table, her posture rigid with authority. "Mrs. Rodriguez," she said, pronouncing the name with deliberate precision. "The rules apply to everyone equally from the moment they sign their purchase agreement. Ignorance is not an excuse, and special treatment creates unfair precedents." The room felt uncomfortably tense. A few residents shifted in their seats, clearly recognizing the hostile undertone in Margaret's voice. Elena felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment, but she maintained her composure and thanked Margaret for the clarification. After the meeting, several neighbors approached Elena privately. They shared their own stories of Margaret's rigid enforcement and unreasonable interpretations of the rules. The picture that emerged was of a woman who had turned neighborhood management into a personal power trip, someone who seemed to enjoy making other people's lives difficult. Elena went home that night, feeling more isolated than ever. She and Miguel had dreamed of raising their children in a friendly community where neighbors looked out for each other. Instead, they found themselves living under the watchful eye of someone who seemed determined to find fault with everything. They did. The spring months continued with a steady stream of violation notices, each more petty than the last. Margaret documented everything. The time Diego's friend rode his bike on the sidewalk, the evening Elena forgot to bring in the recycling bin before 8 p.m., the Saturday morning when Miguel washed his car in the driveway instead of the designated car wash area behind the community center. What Elena and Miguel didn't realize was that Margaret's behavior toward their family was different from her treatment of other residents. While she was strict with everyone, her enforcement against the Rodriguez family was particularly harsh and frequent. Other neighbors began to notice the pattern, and some started to suspect that Margaret's motivations weren't entirely about rule enforcement. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would change everything. Margaret's authority had gone unchecked for too long, and her treatment of the Rodriguez family was becoming increasingly aggressive. The neighborhood was a powder keg waiting for a spark, and that spark was coming sooner than anyone expected. Elena continued to hope that things would improve with time, that Margaret would eventually see them as good neighbors who cared about their community. But Margaret had already decided that the Rodriguez family represented everything she disliked about the changing neighborhood, and she was prepared to make their lives as difficult as possible until they gave up and moved away. The battle lines were drawn, though. Summer arrived in Willowbrook Gardens like a breath of fresh air for most families. But for the Rodriguez household, it brought an escalation of Margaret's harassment that nobody could have predicted. What started as petty violation notices had transformed into something much more sinister and personal. Margaret had become obsessed with the Rodriguez family. Her morning coffee routine now included a detailed inspection of their property from her front window. She had purchased a high-powered camera with a telephoto lens, which she claimed was for bird watching, but everyone knew its real purpose. The camera was always pointed toward 42 Maple Street. Elena started noticing Margaret's increased surveillance in early June. Strange things began happening around their property. Their newspaper would disappear from the driveway, only to be found, crumpled in a nearby bush. Garden tools left in the backyard would mysteriously move overnight. Someone was walking through their flower beds, leaving footprints in the soft soil. Miguel installed a simple doorbell camera after finding muddy footprints on their front porch one morning. The camera was basic, nothing fancy, but it captured clear footage with good sound quality. He told Elena it would help them feel safer and maybe catch whoever was messing with their property. The first footage they captured was shocking. At 2 a.m, Margaret was clearly visible walking around their backyard with a flashlight, taking photos of their vegetable garden and measuring the height of their fence with a tape measure. When Miguel showed the footage to his neighbor, Mr. Johnson, the older man just shook his head sadly. "She's done this before," Mr. Johnson admitted. "The family that lived in your house before you moved out because of her. She made their lives so miserable that they sold the house for less than it was worth just to get away from her." Elena felt sick to her stomach. They had put everything they had into buying this house. Moving wasn't an option, even if they wanted. Miguel was working extra shifts at the hospital, and Elena had taken on tutoring jobs after school to help with the mortgage payments. This was their home, and they weren't going to be forced out by one bitter woman. Margaret's behavior became more brazen as the weeks passed. She started showing up at Elena's workplace, sitting in the school parking lot during pickup time, watching and taking notes. She followed Miguel to the grocery store, staying just far enough behind to avoid direct confrontation but close enough to make her presence known. The breaking point was building toward Sophia's 8th birthday party, planned for the second Saturday in July. Elena had invited a few families from the neighborhood, some cousins, and a handful of Sophia's school friends. It was going to be a small backyard celebration with a kiddie pool, some games, and homemade cake. Elena had checked the HOA rules carefully before planning the party. Gatherings under 20 people didn't require advance notice. The noise ordinance didn't begin until 8 p.m. on weekends. They had planned everything to end by 6 o'clock, well within the guidelines. Margaret had other plans. 3 days before the party, she submitted a formal complaint to the city about planned nuisance activities at the Rodriguez address. She claimed they were planning to violate multiple city ordinances and HOA regulations. When the city inspector came out to investigate, he found nothing wrong with their party plans and seemed embarrassed about the complaint. "Ma'am," the inspector told Elena, "there's nothing illegal about having a birthday party in your own backyard. I'm sorry someone wasted your time and mine with this complaint." The morning of Sophia's party dawned hot and humid, typical for July. Elena was up early, decorating the backyard with colorful balloons and streamers. Miguel inflated the small kiddie pool they had bought for the occasion. Sophia and Diego were practically vibrating with excitement, helping arrange chairs and set up the games. Margaret positioned herself at her front window by 10 a.m., camera ready. She'd called 3 different city departments that morning, reporting noise violations that hadn't happened yet and claiming the Rodriguez family was running an illegal daycare operation. The first guests arrived at noon. The Chen family from down the street brought their twin boys. Elena's sister came with her 2 daughters. A few of Sophia's school friends showed up with their parents, who were excited to finally meet their neighbors properly. The party was exactly what Elena had hoped for. The kids splashed in the little pool, played tag in the backyard, and devoured pizza and birthday cake. The adults sat in lawn chairs chatting about work and kids and neighborhood life. It was the kind of normal, happy family gathering that should have been completely unremarkable. Margaret watched from her window for 2 hours, documenting everything. At exactly 2:30 p.m., She marched across the street like a woman on a mission. Her face was red with anger, and she was clutching a folder full of papers in one hand and her phone in the other. Elena saw her coming and tried to intercept her before she reached the backyard where the children were playing. "Hi, Margaret," Elena said pleasantly, hoping to diffuse whatever was about to happen. "Would you like to join us? There's plenty of cake." What happened next was captured in perfect detail by Miguel's doorbell camera. Margaret's response was immediate and explosive. She started screaming about property values and noise violations, even though the party was well within the legal limits and barely louder than normal conversation. "This is a residential neighborhood, not a public park," Margaret shouted, her voice carrying across the entire street. "Some people have no respect for their neighbors or community standards." Elena tried to remain calm, explaining that they had followed all the rules and would be wrapping up the party soon anyway. But Margaret wasn't interested in reasonable conversation. She was there for a confrontation, and nothing Elena said was going to prevent it. The other parents began gathering their children, clearly uncomfortable with the hostile situation. Sophia started crying, asking her mom why the mean lady was yelling at their party. Diego tried to comfort his little sister while the other kids stood frozen, not understanding what was happening. Margaret's tirade continued for several minutes, growing more personal and nasty with each passing moment. She made comments about certain types of families who didn't understand how to live in a nice neighborhood. She criticized Elena's parenting, claiming the children were too loud and disruptive. She even attacked Miguel's work schedule, saying shift workers brought down the character of the community. Miguel finally stepped forward, trying to protect his family from the verbal assault. He asked Margaret politely but firmly to lower her voice and let them finish their daughter's birthday party in peace. This only made Margaret angrier. "Don't you dare tell me what to do on my own street," she screamed. "I've been living here longer than you've probably been in this country." The comment hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several of the other parents exchanged shocked glances. Even Margaret seemed to realize she had crossed a line, but instead of backing down, she doubled down on her aggression. When Miguel tried to close his front door to end the confrontation, Margaret grabbed his arm, her fingernails digging into his skin hard enough to leave marks. "I'm not done talking to you," she snarled. The doorbell camera captured everything in crystal clear detail. Margaret's face was clearly visible, her voice was perfectly audible, and every aggressive gesture was documented. What she didn't know was that several neighbors had also started recording with their phones once they heard the shouting. The confrontation finally ended when Mr. Johnson came over and physically stepped between Margaret and the Rodriguez family. "That's enough, Margaret," he said firmly. "Go home." Margaret stormed back to her house, still shouting threats about reporting them to every authority she could think of. The birthday party was ruined. Sophia spent the rest of the afternoon crying in her room, asking why someone would be so mean on her special day. That evening, after all the guests had gone home and the kids were finally asleep, Miguel and Elena sat in their living room reviewing the doorbell camera footage. They watched in silence as Margaret's mask of neighborhood authority completely slipped away, revealing the angry, bitter person underneath. Miguel's arm still bore the scratch marks from Margaret's fingernails. Elena's hands were shaking as she realized how close the situation had come to physical violence in front of their children and neighbors. They had reached a crossroads. They could continue to endure Margaret's harassment in silence, hoping it would eventually stop, or they could take action to protect their family. The camera had given them something they'd never had before. Proof of what they were dealing with. The decision about what to do with that proof would change everything. Miguel stared at his phone screen for 3 days straight, watching the doorbell camera footage over and over again. The video was damning evidence of Margaret's behavior, but posting it online felt like crossing a line he wasn't sure he was ready to cross. Elena found him in their bedroom at midnight on Tuesday, still debating what to do. "I keep thinking about Sophia crying at her own birthday party," Elena said softly, sitting beside her husband on the bed. "And what if Margaret does this to another family? What if someone else's children have to go through what ours did?" Miguel nodded, his thumb hovering over the upload button on his phone. They had edited the video carefully, blurring out the faces of all the children at the party to protect their privacy. Margaret's face and voice remained completely clear. The audio was perfect, capturing every word of her 15-minute outburst. Elena had helped write a simple caption. "This happened at my daughter's 8th birthday party. My family just wants to live in peace in our own home. This is what HOA harassment looks like." On Wednesday evening, Miguel finally pressed upload. He posted the video to TikTok first, then Facebook, then Twitter. He wasn't expecting much response. Maybe a few neighbors would see it and understand what they were dealing with. Maybe it would help other families in similar situations. He went to bed that night with 17 views on TikTok and 3 sympathetic comments from friends. Miguel woke up Thursday morning to his phone buzzing nonstop. Elena was shaking him awake, her eyes wide with shock. "Miguel, look at your phone, look at the numbers." The TikTok video had 50,000 views. Facebook showed 25,000 shares. Twitter was exploding with retweets and comments. Miguel's phone kept buzzing with notifications faster than he could read them. By lunchtime Thursday, the video had reached 500,000 views across all platforms. Local news stations were calling Miguel's phone, wanting interviews. Neighbors were knocking on their door, some supportive, others curious about the sudden attention. Elena picked up Sophia from school to find other parents approaching her in the pickup line. "We saw the video," one mother said quietly. "We had no idea what you were dealing with. That woman's behavior is completely unacceptable." The comments section under the video was filled with similar stories. People from across the country were sharing their own experiences with nightmare HOA board members and difficult neighbors. Some comments made Elena laugh, others made her cry. The support from complete strangers was overwhelming. By Friday morning, the video had crossed into viral territory. 2.5 million views on TikTok alone. Major news outlets were picking up the story. Miguel's work phone at the hospital was ringing with interview requests from journalists across the country. Margaret's full name and address were quickly identified by internet users who recognized the neighborhood. Her employer, Henderson Accounting Services, began receiving calls from potential clients who had seen the video. Her husband Robert, who worked as a principal at Roosevelt Middle School, found parents gathering in his office demanding explanations about his wife's behavior. The reaction in Willowbrook Gardens was swift and dramatic. Margaret hadn't left her house since the video went viral, but neighbors could see her peeking through her curtains at the increasing number of cars driving slowly past her house. Some people were taking selfies in front of her perfectly manicured lawn. Elena felt conflicted about the attention. Part of her was relieved that people finally understood what their family had endured, but another part of her worried about the intensity of the online response. She never wanted to ruin Margaret's life, just to stop the harassment of her family. The neighborhood Facebook group, which usually focused on lost pets and yard sale announcements, exploded with activity. Long time, residents began sharing their own stories about Margaret's behavior over the years. The pattern that emerged was disturbing and consistent. The Peterson family revealed that Margaret had made their teenage son's life miserable, constantly reporting him for minor infractions like riding his skateboard on the sidewalk. The elderly, Mr. Martinez, shared how Margaret had harassed his late wife about their rose garden, claiming the flowers were the wrong shade of pink for the neighborhood aesthetic. Most shocking was the story from the Williams family, who had lived on Oak Street for 12 years. They revealed that Margaret had actually called Child Protective Services on them twice, making false reports about neglect because their children played outside past Margaret's preferred quiet hours. "We've all been living in fear of this woman for years," Mrs. Peterson wrote in the Facebook group. "Thank you to the Rodriguez family for finally showing everyone what we've been dealing with." By Saturday, Henderson Accounting Services had posted a statement on their website announcing Margaret's immediate termination. The statement was brief and professional, mentioning their commitment to community values and respectful behavior. Margaret's husband Robert faced increasing pressure from parents and the school board about his wife's viral infamy. The weekend brought an emergency HOA meeting that nobody had officially called. Word spread through text messages and social media posts. Over 150 residents packed into the community center, with many more joining through a hastily arranged video call. It was the largest HOA gathering in Willowbrook Gardens history. Miguel and Elena arrived to find neighbors they'd never met approaching them with words of support. People were sharing stories, apologizing for not speaking up sooner, and expressing outrage about Margaret's years of unchecked behavior. Margaret appeared at the meeting with her husband and a lawyer she'd hired that morning. She looked completely different from the confident woman who had terrorized the birthday party just 1 week earlier. Her usually perfect hair was disheveled, her makeup couldn't hide the dark circles under her eyes, and her hands shook as she clutched a folder of prepared statements. The lawyer tried to control the narrative from the beginning. He stood up and announced that his client was considering legal action against anyone who shared the video, claiming it was recorded without consent and violated Margaret's privacy rights. The room erupted in angry voices. "Privacy rights in someone else's front yard?" shouted Mr. Johnson, while harassing a family at their child's birthday party. Margaret tried to address the crowd directly, her voice cracking with desperation. "That video doesn't show the whole story," she said, standing on shaky legs. "It was taken out of context. I was trying to address legitimate neighborhood concerns about noise and property values. Someone in the back of the room had connected their laptop to the projector. Let's watch it again and see what context we're missing," they called out. As the video began playing on the large screen, Margaret's face went white. Hearing her own voice fill the community center, seeing her aggressive behavior projected for everyone to witness, was more than she could handle. She started hyperventilating, fanning herself with the papers from her folder. "Turn it off," she screamed, but the crowd demanded to see the full footage. They watched in silence as Margaret's professional mask completely disappeared, revealing the bitter, angry person underneath. When the video ended, the room remained quiet for several long seconds. The vote to remove Margaret from all HOA positions was unanimous. Even her few remaining supporters couldn't defend what they had witnessed. The board also voted to implement new oversight procedures to prevent any future abuse of power. Margaret and her lawyer left the meeting early, pushing through the crowd of angry neighbors. Someone shouted, "Good riddance," as they reached the parking lot. Elena felt emotionally drained but relieved. The community had finally seen the truth about Margaret's behavior. More importantly, other families would be protected from similar harassment in the future. The viral video continued spreading throughout the following week, becoming a cautionary tale about HOA overreach and neighborhood bullying. Miguel and Elena declined most interview requests, wanting to return to normal family life as much as possible. But Margaret wasn't finished fighting. Despite losing her job, her position, and her reputation, she was preparing for one final battle that would play out in court. She convinced herself that she was the real victim, that the viral video had destroyed her life unfairly. The legal consequences were just beginning, and Margaret's worst moment was yet to come. The legal papers arrived at the Rodriguez house on a rainy Tuesday morning in September. Miguel was getting ready for his shift at the hospital when Elena called him to the front door. A process server stood on their porch, holding an official-looking envelope that would change everything. Margaret had filed a massive lawsuit against the Rodriguez family, claiming defamation, invasion of privacy, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. She was seeking $200,000 in damages, claiming the viral video had destroyed her reputation and livelihood. Her lawyer had crafted a narrative that painted Margaret as the innocent victim of a social media attack. Elena's hands trembled as she read through the legal documents. The lawsuit claimed that Miguel and Elena had deliberately edited the video to make Margaret look bad, that they had invaded her privacy by recording her without permission, and that they had orchestrated a campaign to destroy her life. Miguel called in sick to work and spent the morning on the phone with lawyers. The first 3 attorneys he contacted were either too expensive or not interested in taking on a case that had received so much public attention. Finally, they found David Chen, a civil rights lawyer who had experience with harassment cases. "I've seen the video," David told them during their first meeting. "What happened to your family was wrong and you had every right to document it, but I need you to understand that this is going to be a long, expensive fight. Margaret has hired a very aggressive law firm." Margaret's lawyer was Patricia Blackwood, known around town for taking controversial cases and winning through intimidation tactics. She had already started a public relations campaign, giving interviews to anyone who would listen about how her client was being persecuted by internet mobs. 2 weeks later, the Rodriguez family received another surprise. The district attorney's office called to inform them that they were pressing criminal charges against Margaret for assault and harassment. The scratches on Miguel's arm, combined with the video evidence of Margaret grabbing him, were enough to file criminal charges. Margaret's world was falling apart piece by piece. Her husband Robert had taken a leave of absence from his job as school principal after parents demanded his resignation. Their marriage was crumbling under the pressure. Margaret spent her days obsessively reading online comments about the video, becoming more convinced that she was the victim of a massive conspiracy. The preliminary hearings began in October. Margaret arrived at the courthouse each day wearing expensive suits and surrounded by her legal team. She had clearly spent a fortune on her defense, hiring not just Patricia Blackwood but also a social media expert and a video analysis consultant. Margaret's strategy became clear during the first hearing. She was going to claim that the video had been manipulated using artificial intelligence technology. Her expert witness, a man with questionable credentials who specialized in conspiracy theories, testified that voices could be faked and faces could be altered to make someone appear to say things they never said. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Lisa Park, was prepared for this defense. They had the original video file from Miguel's doorbell camera, complete with metadata that proved it hadn't been edited. They also had testimony from multiple neighbors who had witnessed the birthday party confrontation. Elena found the preliminary hearings emotionally exhausting. Sitting in the courtroom while Margaret's lawyer attacked her family's character and motives was harder than she had expected. Patricia Blackwood painted Elena as a manipulative woman who had orchestrated the entire situation to gain sympathy and money. Mrs. Rodriguez knew exactly what she was doing when she posted that video. Blackwood argued during one hearing, "She wanted to destroy my client's life and she succeeded. This family has profited from their 15 minutes of fame while my client lost everything." The accusation stung because there was a grain of truth to it. The Rodriguez family had received some money from a legal defense fund that supporters had set up online. They had also been offered opportunities for paid interviews and sponsorship deals, though they had turned most of them down. Miguel's testimony was powerful and straightforward. He described years of harassment, the escalating behavior, and the fear his family felt living under Margaret's constant surveillance. When Patricia Blackwood tried to discredit him during cross-examination, suggesting that he had planned the confrontation, Miguel's response was simple and honest. "I just wanted my daughter to have a happy birthday party," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "No parent should have to deal with what we went through." The most damaging evidence against Margaret came from her own social media history. The prosecution had discovered years of posts in neighborhood Facebook groups where Margaret made disparaging comments about families who didn't meet her standards. She had complained about certain types of people moving into the neighborhood and expressed frustration about declining community values. One particularly damaging post from 2 years earlier showed Margaret complaining about a Hispanic family's quinceañera celebration, calling it inappropriate noise, and suggesting that some cultures didn't understand how to behave in civilized neighborhoods. Margaret's defense team tried to explain away these posts as normal neighborhood concerns, but the pattern was clear to everyone in the courtroom. This wasn't about HOA rules or property values. This was about prejudice and control. The civil case moved forward alongside the criminal proceedings. Margaret's lawyers demanded that the viral video be taken down from all social media platforms, claiming it violated their client's rights. When that failed, they tried to get a gag order preventing the Rodriguez family from talking to the media. Elena and Miguel found themselves living in a strange, new reality. Their quiet family life had been replaced by constant legal meetings, court appearances, and media attention. Sofia and Diego struggled to understand why their parents seemed so stressed all the time, and why reporters sometimes showed up at their school. The community support remained strong throughout the legal proceedings. Neighbors organized fundraisers to help with legal expenses. The HOA even passed a resolution supporting the Rodriguez family and condemning Margaret's behavior. Local businesses displayed signs reading, "We stand with the Rodriguez family." Margaret became increasingly isolated as the legal battle continued. Her few remaining friends distanced themselves from the controversy. She moved out of the family, home after her husband filed for divorce, taking an apartment across town where she spent her days preparing for court with an obsessive determination. Her lawyers tried multiple strategies to discredit the video evidence. They brought in technology experts who claimed the footage could have been altered. They hired private investigators to dig up dirt on the Rodriguez family. They even suggested that Miguel's job at the hospital gave him access to drugs that could have made Margaret behave irrationally. Each desperate attempt to avoid responsibility only made Margaret look worse. The prosecution methodically dismantled every alternative theory, showing that the video was authentic, the timeline was accurate, and Margaret's behavior was consistent with years of documented harassment. As the trial date approached, both sides prepared for a final showdown. The Rodriguez family had endured months of legal harassment on top of the original neighborhood harassment. They were exhausted, but determined to see justice done. Margaret's mental state had deteriorated significantly under the pressure. She had convinced herself that she was fighting for justice, that everyone was lying about her, and that the video evidence was part of an elaborate conspiracy against her. Her lawyers were privately concerned about her stability, but continued to follow her directions. The stage was set for a courtroom confrontation that would finally resolve the case. Margaret was determined to prove her innocence no matter what the evidence showed. The Rodriguez family just wanted their nightmare to end so they could return to normal life. Nobody could have predicted just how dramatically Margaret would react when forced to watch her own behavior played back in front of a packed courtroom. The final act of this neighborhood drama was about to unfold in the most public and humiliating way possible. October 15th dawned cold and gray, matching the somber mood as everyone prepared for the final day in court. Elena Rodriguez woke up before her alarm, her stomach churning with nervous energy. After months of legal battles, depositions, and sleepless nights, today would finally determine whether justice would be served. Miguel had taken the day off from the hospital, something he rarely did. The family had discussed whether Sofia and Diego should attend, but ultimately decided the courtroom was no place for children. Elena's sister would watch them after school, keeping them busy with homework and video games to distract from the day's events. The courthouse was buzzing with activity by 8 a.m. News vans lined the street outside, their satellite dishes pointing skyward like metallic flowers. Reporters clutched coffee cups and checked their equipment, knowing that today's proceedings would likely make headlines across the country. Elena and Miguel arrived with their lawyer, David Chen, who had become like family over the past months. David had prepared them for what to expect, but courthouse atmospheres always felt intimidating. The marble floors echoed with footsteps, and the high ceilings made everything feel more serious and official. Margaret arrived 30 minutes later, flanked by her expensive legal team. She looked dramatically different from the confident HOA president she had been just months earlier. Her hair was thinner, her face gaunt from stress and poor sleep. She wore a black suit that seemed to hang loose on her shrinking frame. The courtroom filled quickly with spectators. Neighbors from Willowbrook Gardens occupied several rows, most showing support for the Rodriguez family. Local news reporters sat in the designated press section, notebooks ready. Even some people who had followed the case online had driven from other cities to witness the conclusion. Judge Rebecca Torres called the court to order at exactly 9 a.m. She was known for running a tight courtroom and had little patience for theatrics. Margaret's lawyer, Patricia Blackwood, immediately requested a private conference with the judge, hoping to delay or limit the video evidence presentation. "Your Honor," Blackwood argued, "my client has suffered enough public humiliation. Playing this video again will only serve to inflame public opinion and prejudice the proceedings." Judge Torres denied the request firmly. The video is central evidence in both the criminal and civil cases. The jury needs to see the complete unedited footage to make an informed decision. Elena felt her heart racing as the bailiff set up the projection equipment. She had seen the video hundreds of times by now, but watching it in a packed courtroom, would be different. She glanced at Margaret, who was gripping the defendant's table so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The prosecution had decided to play the full 15-minute confrontation without interruption. They wanted the jury to experience the complete timeline of events, from Margaret's initial approach to the final aggressive grab that left scratches on Miguel's arm. As the video began, the courtroom fell completely silent. You could hear every word clearly, every aggressive tone, every escalating threat. The footage was devastating in its clarity and completeness. There was no ambiguity about what had happened or who was responsible. Margaret's breathing became increasingly rapid as her own voice filled the courtroom. She watched herself on the large screen, seeing her behavior from an outside perspective, for the first time. The woman in the video looked exactly like what she was, a bully who had lost control and revealed her true character. 3 minutes into the video, Margaret stood up abruptly. "That's not real," she shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. "Someone faked that. It's artificial intelligence." Judge Torres banged her gavel sharply. "Ms. Henderson, you will remain seated and quiet, or you will be removed from this courtroom." But Margaret was beyond reasoning. Months of legal pressure, financial ruin, and social isolation had pushed her past her breaking point. She pointed at the screen with a shaking finger. "That's not me. I never said those things. Someone made that up." The video continued playing, showing Margaret grabbing Miguel's arm and leaving visible scratches. The audio captured her threatening to make the family's life miserable until they moved away. Every word was clear, every action undeniable. "Stop it. Stop that right now," Margaret screamed, her voice echoing off the courtroom walls. "This is all lies. They're trying to destroy me." The judge ordered the bailiff to approach Margaret, but she was in full panic mode now. Her lawyer tried to calm her down, but Margaret pushed her away. "Even you don't believe me," she wailed. "Nobody believes me." Patricia Blackwood looked mortified. In 30 years of legal practice, she had never had a client completely melt down during a trial. She whispered urgently to Margaret, trying to get her to sit down and stay quiet, but Margaret was beyond listening. The video reached the moment where Margaret made her most damaging comments about the family not belonging in the neighborhood. Hearing her own words played back in the silent courtroom was the final straw. Margaret's face went completely pale, then flushed bright red. "I'm not like that," she screamed, her voice breaking into sobs. "I'm a good person. I was just trying to protect our neighborhood. Why can't anyone understand that?" The courtroom watched in stunned silence as Margaret hyperventilated, fanning herself frantically with her legal papers. Elena felt a mixture of justice and pity watching Margaret's complete breakdown. This wasn't how she had wanted things to end. Margaret's breathing became more labored. She clutched her chest, gasping for air. "I can't breathe," she whispered. Then louder, "I can't breathe. Someone help me." Judge Torres immediately called for medical assistance and ordered the courtroom cleared except for essential personnel. The bailiff radioed for paramedics while Margaret's lawyer tried to keep her calm and upright. But Margaret wasn't having a medical emergency. She was having a complete psychological break. As the paramedics arrived and began checking her vital signs, she kept repeating the same phrases over and over. "It's not real, they changed it, I'm not a bad person." The paramedics determined that Margaret was physically stable, but recommended a psychological evaluation. Judge Torres made the difficult decision to continue the proceedings without the defendant present, since Margaret had clearly demonstrated she couldn't control herself in the courtroom. The jury deliberation took less than 2 hours. They found Margaret guilty on all criminal charges: assault, harassment, and disturbing the peace. The civil case was decided in favor of the Rodriguez family, awarding them $75,000 in damages plus attorney fees. When Margaret was brought back to hear the verdict, she was heavily sedated and flanked by medical personnel. She barely reacted as Judge Torres read the sentences: 30 days in county jail, 2 years probation, mandatory anger management classes, and a restraining order preventing her from contacting the Rodriguez family. Elena felt a complex mix of emotions as she watched Margaret being led away in handcuffs. Justice had been served, but seeing another human being's complete breakdown was still difficult to witness. Margaret had brought this on herself through years of harassment and bullying, but her final courtroom collapse was almost pitiable. The media circus outside the courthouse was intense. Reporters shouted questions about the dramatic courtroom, scene in Margaret's mental state. Elena and Miguel gave a brief statement thanking their supporters and expressing hope that their family could finally return to normal life. Margaret served her full 30-day sentence, spending most of it in the medical wing due to ongoing psychological issues. Her husband's divorce was finalized while she was in jail. She lost her house to legal fees and had to move to a small apartment across town. The Rodriguez family gradually returned to peaceful life at 42 Maple Street. Sofia and Diego could finally play in their backyard without fear of harassment. Elena planted a beautiful garden where Margaret's spy camera used to be pointed. Miguel continued his work at the hospital, proud that his family had stood up to a bully and won. The viral video became a case study in law schools about harassment, social lie, media evidence, and the consequences of unchecked authority. Margaret's dramatic courtroom breakdown was replayed countless times online, serving as a cautionary tale about what happens when hatred and control consume a person completely. Willowbrook Gardens became a more peaceful neighborhood, with new HOA leadership focused on community building rather than rule enforcement. The Rodriguez family finally had the friendly neighbors they had always hoped for, and their story became a symbol of standing up to bullies and winning through courage and persistence.